Hello and welcome, Warhammer fans. My name is Pued189, and today we're going to be discussing the origin of the vile race, the Skaven, as there might be a bit of a discrepancy on what their origins truly are. As I was making my last video, The War of Vengeance, I saw a bit of an oddity with the dating of the Skaven race's creation, and I wanted to explore that a little bit further, and it was quite interesting what I found. First, we're going to speak of the Tilean city of Tylos, a city that shares the same name of the nation's founding father, and how that is, from, a small amount of research, the origin of Skavenblight. But after that, I'm going to regale you with the myth of Skavenblight's founding in the epic poem The Doom of Kavzar. And after that, we're going to talk about the dates and whether the tale or not is accurate based upon the information given. So, according to the lore that I've found, Tilia was a nation formed from the ruins of the old Elven Empire, once the dwarfs had forced the elves off the mainland during the War of Vengeance, leaving many ruins and abandoned elven cities. There was one section of the nation, however, that the elves avoided, a strip of land that was fertile and ripe, with good soil and natural resources. Why there were no elven settlements there, we don't really know. Perhaps the ancient ethereal race foresaw a great doom would befall that land at some point and so decided to stay away from it entirely. We have really no idea. Either way, according to what I found, the humans settled on that spit of land, creating a great city and naming it Tylos in honor of Tilia's founding father. At some point, groups of dwarfs that had remained nearby after the War of Vengeance had ended showed up and decided to help the men out, teaching them more refined ways to shape metal and stack stone. What occurred is generally unknown among the less mythical lore, but before the dwarfs' time of woes, around 1500 years before Sigmar's birth, the land on that bit of Tilia transformed from a vibrant farmland to what is now known as the Blighted Marshes, and the foundations of Tylos sank beneath the marsh. It never explicitly stated that Skavenblight is Tylos, but every resource heavily implies this. They even use the same artwork for both Tylos and Skavenblight, a dark city within the glowing green marsh. So I will begin to read the entirety of this old Tilian tale called The Doom of Kavzar, and I would have merely given a brief description, but it's important to see the tale in its unabridged form so we can take a good look at what is and is not contradictory to the lore. The Doom of Kavzar. Once upon a time, yeah, it actually starts with that, long, long ago, men and dwarfs lived together beneath the roof of one great city. Some said it was the oldest and greatest city in the world and had existed before the time of the Longbeards and Manlings. It says build instead of built for some reason. Built by older and wiser hands in the dawn of the world. The city lay both above and below the earth, in keeping with the nature of the populace that dwelt there. The dwarfs ruled in their great halls of stone below ground and wrestled the fruits of the rock free with their day-long toil, while the manlings reaped the fields of swaying corn that surrounded the city with a patchwork blanket of gold. The sun smiled, men laughed, and everyone was happy. One day, the men of the city decided that they should give praise to their gods for their good fortunes. They planned a temple such as the world had never seen before. In the central square, a colossal hall would be built and topped with a single cloud-piercing tower, a tower so tall it would touch the very heart of the heavens. After much planning, and with the help of the Longbeards, they set about their monumental task. Weeks became months, and months became years, and still the manlings built. Men grew old and gray working on that great temple, their sons continuing their work through the summer sun and winter rain. At last, after many generations, work began on the great spire itself. Years passed, and the tower reached such a height that the manlings found it ever more difficult to take the stone up to the top. Eventually, the work slowed to a crawl, and finishing the tower seemed impossible. Then one came among the men of the city who offered his help in their great scheme. He asked a single boon of them in return and claimed that if they would grant him this, he would complete the tower in a single night. The manlings said to themselves, "What have we to lose?" and offered to make a bargain with the gray-clad stranger. All he wished was to add his own dedication to the gods onto the temple structure. The manlings agreed, and the bargain was struck. At dusk the stranger entered the unfinished temple and bade the manlings to return at midnight. Clouds swept over the moons, cloaking the temple in darkness as the manlings left. All over the city, men watched and waited as the hours slipped past until, near midnight, by ones and twos they gathered again in the temple square. The wind blew and the clouds parted as they gazed up at the temple. It rose like an unbroken lance against the sky, pure and white. At its very peak a great horned bell hung gleaming coldly in the moonlight. The stranger's dedication to the gods was there, but of the stranger himself there was no sign. The manlings rejoiced that their father's work was done. They surged forward to enter the temple. Then at the stroke of midnight the great bell began to toll. Once, twice, thrice, slow, heavy waves of sound rolled across the city. 4, 5, 6 times the bell rang, like the torpid pulse of a bronze giant. 7, 8, 9, the rolling of the bell grew louder with each toll. Ring, and the manlings staggered back from the temple steps clutching their ears. 10, 11, 12, 13. At the 13th stroke, lightning split the skies and thunder echoed across the night. Or echoes through the night. I don't know why they made it present tense. High above, the dark circle of Morsalib was lit by a bright flash, and all fell ominously silent. The manlings fled to their beds, frightened and puzzled by the portents they had seen. Next morning they arose to find that the darkness had come to their city. Brooding storm clouds reared above the rooftops, and such rain fell as had never been seen before. Black, like ash, the rain fell and puddled in the streets, slicking the cobbles with darkly iridescent colors. At first some of the manlings didn't worry. They waited for the rain to stop so that they might resume their work, but the rain did not stop. The winds blew stronger and lightning shook the high tower. Days stretched into weeks, and still the rain did not stop. Each night the bell tolled 13 times, and each morning the darkness lay across the city. The manlings became fearful and prayed to their gods. Still the rains did not stop, and the black clouds hung like a shroud over the fields of flattened corn. The manlings went to the dwarfs and beseeched their help. The Longbeards were unconcerned. What matters a little rain on the surface? What matter is a little rain on the surface? In the bosom of the earth all was warm and dry. Now the manlings huddled in their dwellings, fear gnawing at their hearts. They sent some of their number to faraway places to seek help, but none of them returned. Some went to the temple to pray and sacrifice their dwindling food to the gods, but they found the temple door closed to them. The rain grew heavier. Dark hailstones fell from the sky and crushed the sodden crops. The great bell tolled a death knell over the terrified city. Soon great stones cleft the heavens, rushing down like dark meteors to smash the homes of the manlings. Many sickened and died from no apparent cause, and the newborn babies of the manlings were hideously twisted. Skulking vermin devoured what little stored corn there was left, and the manlings began to starve. The manling elders went to see the dwarfs again, and this time demanded their help. They wanted to bring their folk below ground to safety. They wanted food. The Longbeards grew angry and told the manlings that the lower workings were flooded and their food had also been devoured by rats. There remained barely enough food and shelter for them and their kinsmen. They cast the manlings out of their halls and closed the doors once more. In the ruins of the city above, each day became more deadly than the last. The manlings despaired and called for succor from the dark gods, whispered the names of forgotten demon princes in the hope of salvation. But none came. Instead the vermin returned, bigger and bolder than ever. Their slinking, furred shapes infested the broken city, feasting on the fallen and pulling down the weak. Each midnight the bell tolled 13 times on high, seeming now brazen and triumphant. The manlings lived as hunted creatures in their own city as great rat packs roamed the streets in search of them. At last the desperate manlings took up such weapons as they had and beat upon the dwarf's door, threatening that if they did not emerge they would drag them out by their beards. No reply came from within. The manlings took up beams and battered down the doors to reveal the tunnels below, dark and empty. Steeling themselves, the pitiful remnants of the city's once proud populace descended. In the ancient hall of kingship they found the dwarfs, now naught but gnawed bones and scraps of cloth, and there they saw by the dying light of their torches the myriad eyes about them, glittering like liquid midnight as the rats closed in for the kill. The manlings stood back to back and fought for their lives, But against such implacable ferocity and countless numbers of the verminous horde, their weapons were useless. The tide of monstrous rats flowed over them one by one, dragging them down to be torn apart, the yellow chisel teeth sinking into their soft flesh, the dark tufted mass drowning their pitiful screams with their hideous chittering. Now let's look at some of the inconsistencies. I think the obvious one is the city had not been there since the beginning of the world. That just goes against the lore in its entirety, but that's a small embellishment of the truth, so we can ignore that. As for the curse itself, I'll assume most people watching this understand the most basic rules of chaos. A contradictory statement, but still. However, to give some clarity, back in the days of yore, while the lizardmen, dwarfs, and elves fought against the first great incursion of chaos, the elves made the ritual known as the Vortex in the center of their island nation of Ulthuan. This ritual perpetually drains the world of chaos energy, which means that the demons that ravaged the world, as did the chaos magic that warped the landscape and the animals, were unable to function unless they were within the northernmost and southernmost regions of the world, as these were where the collapsed warp gates were located. Now, why am I mentioning this? It's generally theorized that the man who struck the deal with the folk of the city in finishing the construction of the temple was Tzeentch, the Chaos God of Change, or at least a very powerful agent of his. Tilia, to give context, is also near the equator of the Warhammer world. This means that it is one of the few places that does not really need to worry about any chaos incursions, and it has a very low chance of inhabitants gaining any sort of chaos taint, or any kind of mutations. Frankly, the winds of chaos do not flow as strongly here as it does in places closer to the poles, and only in the deepest parts of the chaos wastes can the four gods of chaos manifest themselves in any shape or form, so to have Tzeentch appear in Tilia is far-fetched, to say the least. The only way Tzeentch, or even a powerful servant of his, could show up there is if that particular spot was a part of the chaos wastes, or if it had a huge amount of chaos energy. Now, of course, the elves did steer clear of the area for no discernible reason, so that could be the case, although we don't have any evidence to show why that would be. However, we need to look at this like an historical account. From what we can gather, there are no witnesses that survived whatever cataclysm occurred, which means we have no primary or even secondary sources of what actually happened. From the Warhammer Wiki timeline, we see the Dwarf clan began trade and then settled right by the city of Tylos in 1,950 years before Sigmar. And from now on, I think I'll refer to that as BS. But I mean, silly, yeah, but they're also my initials, so I'm used to it. And that the construction of the Great Temple began in 1880 BS, and that construction lasted for 100 years. And then it goes to say that in the year 1600 BS, the first Skaven emerged from Skavenblight. These dates are contradictory. One, Snorri Halfdan, the son of Gotrek Starbreaker, who was the Dwarf King during the War of the Beard, lost a few fingers to a Skaven. This occurred around 2,000 years before Sigmar, or 2,000 years BS. Not only that, but the humans would not have had the technology or the claim to the land of Tilia at 1950 BS because the War of Vengeance was being fought, and the elves controlled the majority of Tilia. Even once the dwarves swept through Tilia to drive back the elves, the men there are supposed to be barbaric, little more than Copper Age technology. Tylos would be a large hamlet or a primitive village used for agriculture and trade at best. I mean, you could argue that the Tilians, like their Roman counterparts in the real world, were more technologically advanced than their Germanic equivalent, i.e. the Empire, but it is stated and known that Tilians used ruined elven cities to build the foundations of their city-states, which is how they became somewhat advanced somewhat quickly, and this would not have occurred by 1950 BS. So, what does all this mean? Due to the contradictions of the legend and the timeline, I have to conclude that the story of the Skaven's creation is dubious and, quite frankly, false. My best guess is that it is allegorical. I believe that as Tilian humans began to creep out of the forests and caves, and after they are united in a loose collection of tribes by their founding father Tylos, much like Sigmar, They are just out of the hunter-gatherer tradition and find a small bit of land that the elves have ignored. Some stay there, while others stay nomads until the elven cities of the coast are abandoned or destroyed and they settle there instead. Now, if it wasn't for the human records of Tylos having existed, I would say it did not need to have existed at all, but it is canonized in the lore, and so we go on. Before the Tillians find the elven ruins and technology left behind, the populous settlement of Tylos is probably destroyed by a meteor from Morsaleb, or a meteor or chunk of warpstone had been located under the ground of that spot for years, decades, and even millennia, which probably was a potential reason no elves went to that area. Once the humans began to dig and cultivate, rats probably began to hide underground around the farms and mutated into primitive versions of Skaven from that buried warpstone. The Skaven began to dig tunnels under the soil, and eventually the ground collapsed and underground water reserves sprang up as the Skaven devoured whatever humans were left, leaving Tylos a husk amid the new swamp the natives would call the Blighted Marshes. But that's my theory, however. It's not canon, but based on the evidence, that seems the most likely explanation. What do you guys think of the Skaven founding myth? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for listening. I hope to see you again soon.